We've got 5 panels, excellent speakers, and what I hope will be a genuinely interesting, at times challenging conversation about where politics across Ireland and Britain might be heading. Our first panel this morning will try to answer the pressing question, what's the future of these islands going to look like over the course of the next decade? In the last 10 years alone, we of course had the Brexit referendum, a succession of UK elections that reshuffled the political deck in London, a historic shift in the landscape here in Northern Ireland, and elections in the south where few could have predicted all the results. Politics is moving quickly, and constitutional questions about how we're governed and by whom are becoming more central to the public debate. But if change is coming, the question is whether we are preparing for it properly. Our panellists will bring perspectives from across all of these islands, Northern Ireland, the South, Scotland and Wales, and each has thought seriously about what the next 10 years might hold. So at this point, I'd like you all to welcome our first panel to take their seats on the stage, Claire Hanna, Jim O'Callaghan, Stephen Gethins and Mark Drakeford. So welcome all. Claire, many of you won't need an introduction with Claire, but she is of course the MP for Belfast South and Mid Down. We have to get that bit in because she knows my Saintfield connections. And she is of course the SDLP leader, not to mention, according to one recent newspaper poll, the most popular party leader. Claire, welcome. Jim O'Callaghan is Minister for Justice, the Fianna Fáil TD. He's written and spoken extensively about the need for advanced planning before any future border poll, including on questions of political structures, economic impact and protections for British identity. Jim, I won't if you don't mention that we went to the same college, although we don't know each other, and that there is somebody else who went to that college who had a rather bad impact on Irish affairs.
Don't mention him.
Don't mention him, or the fact that his skull is under the college chapel. But Jim, thanks very much for joining us. Stephen Gethins is Minister for Europe, External Affairs and Energy in the Scottish Government, an SNP MSP now, having just moved out, and that was one of the reasons why they just had a by-election and the party held on to the seat. I'm definitely not going to mention Brazil, Stephen, because we're going to concentrate instead on the constitutional questions. Sorry, it's terrible. Stephen, you're very welcome, and we wish you all the luck for maintaining that position in 6th. Yeah. And finally, Mark Drakeford is former First Minister of Wales, who commissioned the landmark Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. And I do think at one time we did share a breakfast, possibly with Roddy Doyle at a British-Irish meeting some time ago, Mark. Remember it well. You're delighted you can join us. Like you all... I'd like you all to take 2 minutes to address our broad theme, the future of these islands over the next 10 years. What does it look like for you? And Claire, as our host, can you kick us off?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Mark, and to all of you. It was reported to me that my child was arriving at birthday parties saying, in case I forget to say thank you, I had a lovely time. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming and for all of our speakers. Well, Mark, I suppose it is just an acknowledgement that change is happening all around us. The Brexit 10-year anniversary that we're reflecting on shows us that change can tumble around us in an unplanned way. And as Derry said in her introduction, the future shouldn't be left to chance. We don't know exactly how the years ahead and the decade ahead will arrange itself, but we do know that it is prudent to plan. We do know that there's an appetite and a desire for change, and the SDLP is very clear that we don't think the status quo is delivering for people in this region, and that we think a new, agreed and reconciled Ireland back in Europe and with strong relationships across Britain is the most positive arrangement for people to live their lives. So we wanted to take the opportunity to reflect on all that's gone beyond, bring together some of the big political thinkers within the island and talk about how best we can plan that change in a way that learns from the how not to that we've seen over the last 10 years. That was change based on bombast and not on understanding, and it has shown us how not to do it.
Thanks very much, Claire. Jim, maybe you'd like to go next?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. The first thing I want to do is I want to thank Claire and the SDLP for organising this very important event. I want to say it's great to be back in Belfast. I'm also conscious there are people here who may not be aware of the internal politics of Ireland, such as Mark and Stephen. So I just want to out myself in terms of who I am politically. I'm a member of Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party. Sometimes it surprises people when I tell them that the political tradition of Fianna Fáil is derived from radical Protestants, predominantly based in Belfast, who founded the United Irishmen in 1791. And they were people who had a very broad international outlook. They were inspired by what happened in the United States and indeed by what happened in France. And I think what there was an awareness as well as you pass on through Irish history is that although we try to plan change ourselves, it's very much the case that Ireland's politics and Ireland's history is to a large extent dictated and moulded by what happens on the neighbouring larger island. And that's something we've to be aware of now. And I know all of us here are going to try to predict what's going to happen over the next 10 years. I suspect all of us will be wrong, but it is still important that we try to outline what's going to happen. But the most likely thing that's going to happen is something that is unpredictable. And I think we need to look at the politics of the United Kingdom and the politics of Britain. You mentioned that nationalism is evident in Scotland, in Wales, in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. It's also evident in England as well, and that's something we have to be conscious about. And, you know, the future could be not down the predictable pathway of discussions and harmony. It could be that an issue is imposed upon us quite rapidly in terms of a discussion about the future of this Ireland and in terms of are the people in both jurisdictions prepared to vote for something new. So I think it is important that we prepare for it. I know there may be criticisms of what the Irish government is doing, but two essential parts of preparing for it are cooperation between both jurisdictions on the island and reconciliation. And if you look what's happened in terms of the Shared Island Fund, I know some people can be critical of it, but it is helping to build cooperation and engagement between people on both sides of the border on Ireland. And in terms of reconciliation, I think we need to be honest and frank as well. Obviously, violence is and has been an obstacle to engaging with other communities in Northern Ireland, but the legacy proposals that are being put forward is part of the method of resolving that. Legacy was something that wasn't dealt with. I remember speaking to Bertie Ahern about this. The Good Friday Agreement was an outstanding example of diplomacy and political compromise. But he said it didn't really deal with legacy issues. And I think we need to try to deal with that issue in a fair way. But listen, the future is exciting, but the only thing I'll say, it's probably unpredictable as well.
Thanks very much, Jim. Mark, maybe turning to you next. I mean, obviously you were a Labour First Minister, and there was a time when people would have thought Labour were going to be in power in Wales forever and ever. There's been big changes. Plaid Cymru now in the top spot, but also a growing reform vote there. How do you see the next 10 years working out?
Well, the United Kingdom is a voluntary association of 4 nations, and in any voluntary association, there must be choices that people can make to stay and choices that people can make to leave. And I can offer you over a decade ahead, you know, pathways that lead in either direction. I am more optimistic today than I would have been this time last week that a case can be made over 10 years that the United Kingdom is a place where people in Wales would choose to stay, a place where devolution is strengthened and entrenched, where the House of Lords is abolished and replaced by a chamber of the nations and the regions, where a proportional voting system means that the progressive majority, which I think is there across the United Kingdom, is able to express itself politically, and where a solidarity union, where people feel that their membership of the United Kingdom gives them access to really important rights in their lives, that's a pathway over 10 years in which the United Kingdom and the case for it is strengthened. Down a different pathway, you can see how the perversities of a first-past-the-post system produces a reform government in only a few years' time, where there hasn't been a majority for that party in Wales or Scotland and hasn't been a feature in Northern Ireland. and in which the nature of the United Kingdom has changed so radically that its component parts decide that they will be better off elsewhere. From a Welsh point of view, this could lead to the worst of all possible outcomes. Not one in which the people of Wales choose to leave the United Kingdom, but in which the United Kingdom has left Wales, because other parts of the United Kingdom have exercised a right to leave, and Wales is left a sort of progressive pimple on the end of a, well, there we are, you know the rest. Now, for me, and you know, I've always been a believer that in the right circumstances, Wales's future is better off in the United Kingdom. That means that we have to think ahead and prepare. And one of the things I'm very keen that we have a chance to hear about today and discuss is whether there are arrangements that could be envisaged between independent nations in that Celtic arc, which means that a future for Wales is, having left one union, having somewhere else that you could think of being part of. So you're not just left in a sort of completely isolated and unhappy place. And there are many examples across Europe of those arrangements. It would be very good to have a chance to talk about some of them today.
Thanks. If you've got to be a pimple, better to be a progressive pimple anyway. Stephen, the next decade, how do you see this working out? Obviously, Scotland had the independence vote. It was 55-45 for staying in the Union. But recent opinion polls have again shown you commanding more than 50%, whereas in Wales, the independence vote is more like 30% in opinion polls.
Yeah, and let me scene set. So firstly, thanks to you, but also thanks to colleagues in the SDLP for pulling this together. This is really important for us to come together and reflect as colleagues from different political perspectives. We don't do it enough. So just to reflect, so we've just had elections in Scotland in the same way as Wales. The SNP were returned for a 5th term. The Greens also did well, so we have the biggest pro-independence majority within the Scottish Parliament that we've ever had. Also, we had 6 out of 8 of the independence polls that were published during the campaign showed a majority for independence. But what was really interesting is the fact that the biggest divide is not one of geography, income, or any of these others. It's often one of age and the overwhelming majority that you get amongst young people. So I think one poll had something like 3 times as many under 35s believe in independence as believe in staying part of the union. And by 2029, don't worry, I'm just using these for notes, there's something like, by 2029, something like 1 million Scots will not have had the opportunity to vote in the last independence referendum. That's a significant number, and a lot of things have happened since then. So Mark talked there, and I thought Mark queued things up really nicely. He talked about the voluntary union. What is a voluntary union? Because I think that's a really serious conversation that we need to have, because people need an outlet. In 2014, we were told you're part of a voluntary union. If you're part of a voluntary union, there has to be a way out. So what is it? Or there has to be an agreed way forward. Now, this is where I think the Brexit fissure, and it was a fissure across these islands, was really significant. There is no Article 50 within the UK Constitution, whereas there was one. And for me, and just picking up on Mark's point, I very much look towards, and I've started talking about, and this speaks to my academic background, so forgive me, an 18th century model of union is one of the past, whereas we have a 21st century model of union that most of us in this room would agree on, and that's set out in the European treaties, which have got very clear means by which states interact with one another. I think there are also quite interesting examples elsewhere. So you're our nearest neighbours, as well as England, but actually our near neighbours, and historically, if we look elsewhere, look at the way the Nordic states interact with each other, different relationships with the EU, different relationships with each other, come together. And actually the way in which, I think one thing that those of us who are pro-EU forget, the EU has changed profoundly over the past 10 years. You know, we're still arguing about the way it was 10 years ago. Russia's war in Ukraine has changed it profoundly. And if you look at the way in which the Nordic states interact with each other in terms of defence, economics and security, I think there's a huge amount to be learned from. But I think this is part of this learning process. So thank you so much for today.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Claire, you mentioned, I think, in your earlier comments, the Shared Island Initiative, and we've had more details of big money going into health projects and various things like that. Are you of the opinion, though, that that's insufficient? I know that you want an Irish government to do more in terms of a department for unification and so on. Where do you stand on Shared Island Initiative and what a government should be doing in the future?
Shared Island Initiative is brilliant, and I know Colm was involved in the concept and the shaping of that, and it is doing very positive things, both the investments in infrastructure and in capital projects and in dialogue. It's all very positive. We're not negative at all, but we do need to plan for more substantial change, because as the gentlemen have outlined, that is happening, and we can decide here that we're going to be passengers in that change and go along with wherever it takes us, or we can be in the driving seat. And again, Brexit showed how well the Irish government planned for that outcome, even one that they didn't want and that didn't seem particularly likely. We know that the state engaged its resources to have strategies. If only the UK had done a fraction of that planning, we mightn't have been in such a mess. So that's a sensible thing for a government to do. We have suggested a minister for a new Ireland, a cabinet level position, I suppose, to feed into strategies. If you look at, for example, Ireland 2040, the infrastructure plan, it should take account of the fact that another governance arrangement is not just possible, but likely and indeed desirable by the state. If you look at, I suppose, opportunities for convergence in all sorts of public services, in health and transformation, that is something that should be managed in a strategic way. We are also in favour of the re-establishment of the New Ireland Forum. I mean, that is not needing to reinvent the wheel. Ireland did this 4 decades ago, brought together political parties for non-partisan, serious thinking about the future. And what that does is it brings forward a lot of authoritative, credible analysis and data that isn't a case of this academic says this and another one says that. It just allows that serious planning. So as I say, we think it's prudent to ensure that people here aren't just caught on the winds of change from across the water, because it is possible, and we're not wishing it into existence. You know, more negative intent towards Northern Ireland is possible, or this place becomes a pimple in somebody else's plans, for example, to leave the ECHR, and that change could come at a pace we're not ready for. So it's the entirely sensible thing to do. It's how the Irish government conducted itself during Brexit, and it would complement all of the really positive stuff that's happening in Shared Island.
I never thought pimple would become the word of the day, but it has, hasn't it?
Worst possible. Far enough from lunch that we can talk about it.
Jim, I mean, I think it's about 5 years ago you wrote a paper in which you devoted a bit of thinking to the sort of granular detail of how a new Ireland could work. You had the PSNI still in existence. You had Stormont maybe being the place where an upper house would sit. I don't know if you still sort of subscribe to that vision. And also, are you concerned now that Fine Gael has stolen a march on you with its blueprint for unification?
Just to answer your last question, no, I'm not concerned. I think it's healthy that political parties in the South are preparing and discussing this issue. Like from Fianna Fáil's perspective, it is our first aim, Irish reunification. I think Claire is correct. I think a future Irish government is going to have to prepare for constitutional change. Obviously, that decision and the process by which an Irish government prepares for it is a sensitive political issue in itself, because we have to be conscious, not represented in this room as a significant population within Northern Ireland whose political representatives don't want to engage with this issue. And like, how does an Irish government put in place a preparatory scheme which isn't seen by sort of unionism as being threatening or an attempt to steamroller them into something they don't want to do? And that is a sensitive issue. My own view is that, obviously set out in the Good Friday Agreement, there has to be a vote in both jurisdictions in order to achieve constitutional change. It is a very significant issue for the 26 county state, whether or not it votes to become part of a united Ireland. I would have thought a very significant majority of people are in favour of it, but it's a very significant issue, the biggest decision ever made by the Irish state since the Irish Free State was established. So in order for that to happen, like, I think it is, I'm trying to think of the most appropriate word, I think it is responsible for an Irish government to set out what it is would happen, or what it is an Irish government would be prepared to recommend to its citizens if it was the case that we were going to have a reunification referendum. And that is an issue of legitimate concern. It requires, I suppose, discussion in the south. Now, there'd be criticism about that, because people in Northern Ireland would say, well, why aren't you engaging us in the discussion? And at some stage, obviously, there does have to be that discussion, but it is also, it is like a really a three-pronged discussion. It's a discussion in the south, it's a discussion in the north, and it's a discussion around the island. So certainly in terms of the first one, in terms of just the Irish state, I think that is a sensitive way for the Irish state to put out what it is we're prepared to do to achieve Irish reunification. And I think that could be seen as something that isn't threatening or insensitive to other people. Now, there are people in this room who may be completely unsupportive of that. They may say, well, why aren't people in Northern Ireland having a say in the future of an island? But I think it's a sensitive way of starting the discussion by an Irish government in the south.
And you've hinted a couple of times that there's obvious sensitivities, and we know the history of the island. You're Justice Minister now. Do you think this can be handled in a way that things will still stay peaceful, everything will be democratic in the decision-making?
Well, I don't think we can interfere with, or sort of with slow down democratic decisions or democratic debates because there's a threat of violence. Like, we cannot allow violence to dictate the future, or the threat of violence to dictate what democratically elected politicians wish to see happen based on the wishes of their voters and constituents. So, I hope we've moved beyond violence being a means of trying to achieve political change in Ireland. I believe we have. We put in place in 1998 a democratic system whereby there's recognition that if Northern Ireland votes for reunification, if the South votes for reunification, it will happen. And I think we're all Democrats, and hopefully everyone is a Democrat and recognise that even though they mightn't like it, that is something that is the express will of the people who have voted democratically.
Stephen, you obviously had the experience of the independence vote. At that time, the Scottish Government put together a pretty big document saying what an independent Scotland would look like. I mean, if we had a similar sort of big document, say from Dublin, saying this is what your pensions would look like, this is what your health service would look like, do you think that that would act to persuade people, or might it be that a campaign will then get hooked on that granular detail and revolve around it? What was your experience?
So Look, I think you have a responsibility to set out detail about what you do. I think sometimes you can get lost in the granularity, and let me come to the big picture stuff, because, for example, let's say we're debating pensions policy. Well, the whole idea of independence is people in Scotland get the governments that they vote for, and you can set out a very detailed pensions policy, and then you're independent, you lose the election in 5 years' time, and it changes entirely. Which is a point that I make. However, I think there are important elements of it that, for example, if you take Brexit, one of the huge problems with Brexit was the inability to seek losers' consent. It's a really important part, especially when you're talking about constitutional change. And sometimes something that I think about quite a lot is if we become independent, this is why I think the different models of union and the relationships across these islands are so important. How do you take people with you? Because if you don't take people with you, you fail. Now, the Brexit project has failed for many reasons, but one of them is that, and I reflect on Northern Ireland. So I do remember during the, I was in Parliament 2017, it is not for me to talk about how people in Northern Ireland should vote. I've got enough problems of my own, I don't need to think about that. But I do remember in the aftermath of the 2017 vote, for example, when the SDLP and the UUP lost, we lost people like Mark and others at that point, and Sylvia Herman, who was fabulous, was left to try and represent a broader picture. Now that everybody lost as a result of that because we didn't have that broader scope. So I think you can have the challenge of granularity, but some of the thinking has to be done. If you have constitutional change, it's not like an election in the sense that you have to take everybody with you, you have to give everybody ownership, and that means challenging yourself as well. And it's been so interesting here about the conversations that are going on elsewhere in Ireland at the moment, because I do not doubt for one moment that Jim, these conversations are hard and they're challenging to yourselves, but that is the only way in which I suspect you'll be successful in the end.
Mark, you referred to the possibility of Wales being ejected from the union rather than choosing to leave the union. I think something like 27% of the electorate there are thought to maybe hail from England originally, particularly around the border areas. Do you think that the likelihood is that Wales would maybe, even if Scotland and Northern Ireland were to go off in different directions, stay with a rump UK or whatever you want to call it?
Well, I think a rump UK is a very unattractive proposition for Wales because Wales has been a progressive nation politically for as long as there's ever been universal suffrage. And while a lot changed in our elections in May, you can argue that the underlying patterns in Wales remained remarkably solid. 60% of the Welsh population voted for parties that described themselves as being on the centre-left. Choices within the bloc were different, but the bloc was still there. And, it is still a smaller group of people in Wales who support parties of the right, and parties in the right have always had around a third of the vote in Wales. So in some ways, the basic building blocks are unchanged. For that 60% to be left in an alliance with, and this is where I think I can sometimes be a bit more pessimistic than some of the discussion we've heard so far. It's not just that you are left in a unilateral alliance with England, but it's what will that country be like? What will England look like? Because there are some versions of England which are a lot easier to be allied with than others. Now, I don't believe that there is a plurality, a majority of people in England who will support a party like Reform, but the perversity of the first past the post election system means that you can get a government, as we have now, with a big majority on 34% of the vote. That's the real, that's the thing that I think worries me from a Welsh perspective, but it worries me from a perspective of listening to these conversations, because there may not be the time for the careful, considered, let's work it through, let's think about the options. If in just a handful of years' time, people in Ireland, the island of Ireland, will be looking across the Irish Sea to a country where ICE-like snatch squads are arresting people off the street in Britain. Now, in those circumstances, the fissures that are there already might become very wide indeed and very rapidly. So, I was thinking about the point Steve made. I'm very interested. I think the Nordic Council, the Nordic Council of Ministers, it's a really interesting model for a post-UK arrangement. Is England part of that?
I think there's, sorry, if I may, so I know, but there is the elephant in the room in terms of England. Now, I spent a lot of time in England. My wife's from the south of England, and, we inevitably, and also when I was at Westminster, you spend time in England. It is remarkable the extent to which, and I'm sorry to break it to everybody, we're just not part of the conversation in England. How do we bring English people into this conversation? Because they're an important part of our shared islands. And I remember during the Brexit years when it came, and I wrote some stuff on this, but the fright of their lives when the Irish government, who were, I think, the UK's best friends throughout the Brexit process, as critical friends and doing things that were sometimes not entirely popular, south of the border, where people were feeling quite raw about it. And it came as the fright of their lives when people in Westminster, English MPs, realised that the Irish had diplomatic clout, a full seat at the table, and weren't just going to do what they were told. Now, you can take pride in that, whatever else, but there was a serious issue here. How do you engage with people in England about this conversation, because we're not on the radar? They don't understand, for instance, the push for Scottish independence. They just don't get it. They will understand it less in Wales, and they're still getting to grips with the fact that Ireland is a member state of the European Union and wasn't just going to roll over. And I think there's all of us who sit in this room have to think about how we have that conversation with the biggest nation in these islands.
I'm going to come to Claire in a moment. Just back to you though, Mark. You sort of set out your nightmare scenario there with ICE raids. Obviously, you were saying earlier on that you're maybe a little bit more hopeful now with Andy Burnham looking like he's very likely to get into number 10. what would he do for Northern Ireland and for the devolved nations differently, do you think? Because the FT has a story today about his commitment to devolution. He's going to supposedly send number 10 staff up to Manchester and so on.
Well, the reason for my optimism is that I think Andy is genuinely unique in this sense that he's the only senior political figure that I can think of who has seen devolution from both ends of the telescope. You know, he has been a senior member of a Westminster government, and he spent the last nearly a decade in a devolved authority, facing Whitehall and knowing what it's like to be on the receiving end of decisions made there. And I do believe that he is genuinely serious about the need to redistribute wealth, decision-making, opportunity, you know, across the United Kingdom and not just concentrated in the south east. Now, you know, how far will he be able to go? I hope, of course, that he will be at the radical end of that spectrum. I would dearly love him to announce the abolition of the territorial secretaries of state and the inauguration of a powerful single ministry for devolution and constitutional change at the heart of Whitehall that could make some of these things happen. I hope that he will announce the abolition of the House of Lords and that the Second Chamber will meet in the Midlands from now on. Why does it have to meet in London? You know, what a powerful signal that would be of a different sort of United Kingdom. And, you know, there is a path. Whether we can make it happen, we will see. But there is a path, I think, in which that powerful and entrenched sense of devolution changes the nature of the United Kingdom itself, changes the nature of the relationships between its component parts, and the United Kingdom becomes a place where people would wish to belong, not trapped in it because they're denied an exit, not trapped in it because they're frightened that something else could be even worse, but because it's a country that people want to make work and feel optimistic about the chance of doing so.
Claire, it sounds like Mark's about to become a persuader for the United Kingdom. I don't know if you're persuaded there, but in terms of what you witness in London, obviously you're around Westminster a lot. First of all, that sort of sense of us being cut out of the conversation, but also then maybe what a new Burnham administration might do to change anything.
Yeah, look, and we're excited to see what comes as well. We've spent some quality time with Burnham and his team, and some of the stuff around devolution, around places outside of London are positive. And I think just maybe that sense of helping the UK through its existential crisis in terms of Britain and who it is and where its place in the world is and all of that, I think he'll be a positive force. But, and I don't mean to be fatalistic, we are also very clear about the role we play and the size and the impact we can have. The Brexit process laid those power imbalances out very, very clearly. That no matter what we wanted and how many times we expressed it electorally, what South East of England wanted was the writ that ran through the Brexit negotiations, and it was very difficult to get protections for this region secured. I also know as an MP of over 5 years just how low down the priorities we are. Andy Burnham will have 1 million things to deal with, and Northern Ireland is not going to be at the top of the list. Now, that underlines why it's prudent for the executive to take some control, have some vision and deliver for people in the here and now, because kind of years of, well, we'll write to London and we'll ask for more money and we'll not set a budget, and all of those things just unfortunately aren't delivering for people. And we're quite clear that the best path to a new Ireland is through a more functioning region. But I don't think it will dramatically change the conversation that we're having here. To be honest with you, I do think that potentially worse outcomes electorally in Britain do focus minds here. And I think there's so many people who are more open-minded about the future. And yes, a Burnham prime ministership might reassure a lot of people, but they know that a Farage-infused number 10 is a prospect that needs to be taken seriously. And I think things like that and Brexit are changing people's minds. I just think there's a detachment from British politics getting to set the agenda here for a lot of people. They just want to see a different future. So some of what's been going on the other island has been a push factor, but a pull factor is a more open, dynamic economy over the border, a more ethical foreign policy, you know, a sense of managing change and positive integration of people are all drawing more and more people into the conversation.
Jim, obviously there was a rupture in British-Irish relations immediately after the Brexit vote or during the Brexit negotiations, and then there's been a bit of a healing process. How do you see the immediate future ahead now?
Just listening to Stephen, Mark and Claire there, it's interesting listening to them because what you've said could be summarised really by saying, what will England do? And it makes the point I made at the outset that to a large extent, English politics dominates the island. I'm in a better position because I'm from an independent state. We got our independence from the United Kingdom. My view is the best thing that ever happened to the 26 counties. And you look at how Ireland has progressed, and I know there's criticism about how things are in Ireland, but it is a very fine example of a post-colonial independent state. And so the message I would give for any discussion about the future of the islands is independence is the way forward. It has served us well. And I'm conscious that Northern Ireland, like if you look at the history of Ireland in the past 100 years, like for the first 40, 50 years, it really was Northern Ireland was the successful place. And I'm not saying this in any one-upmanship way, by the way, because I don't do that type of politics. But if you look at it now, independence has been a huge success for the 26 counties, and the part of the island that has suffered from partition has been the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. And, you know, I think that by putting forward a plan for the future of an all-island Ireland, what may surprise people from the different tradition in Northern Ireland is that I think they will be surprised by the extent to which the loyalist and unionist tradition in Northern Ireland will be respected and recognised and protected in a united Ireland. And that's something that's a responsibility on people like me to communicate, but it is an important point. In terms of the relationship, what has moved Ireland away from England as well isn't just our independence, it was our membership of the European Union. Like, it is extraordinary to be, I've only been a minister for 18 months. I go to these meetings called JHA meetings. They're the meetings of the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers of the European Union, all 26 countries there. And it is extraordinary to see the influence that Ireland has, small country, independent country, the influence that Ireland has there is remarkable. Like, the French talk to us, the Germans, you know, it's just extraordinary that we are there as an independent country having such influence. And that is a noticeable change in the relationship between the independent Irish state and the UK, because now we're an equal.
For a long time, it was taken as a bit of a given that the electorate in the south would always vote for unification because that's been the vision for so long. But you know, you now have, as you were saying, you've been doing so well economically, and there is the contrast with Northern Ireland not doing so well. Could there be any reluctance, possibly, given, you know, for instance, the West German economy did take a bit of a hit in the short term, didn't it, when they were trying to integrate East Germany? And also beyond the economics, what about the politics? Sometimes you get the sense that people in the south will be happy if Northern Ireland was grafted on and there were no changes whatsoever to the anthem, the flag, the constitution or whatever. But things would have to change, wouldn't they?
Unquestionably, there would be some reluctance there. But ultimately, I think all those issues and debates, whether it's about the economy, like the economy will grow through a unified Ireland. It'll be of huge advantage to Northern Ireland, and it'll, I think, improve the economy of the whole island as well. There obviously are sensitive issues about flags and anthems. We don't need to discuss them at present. Like, we always start with the most difficult issue. Let's just park them. But that's why I go back to the point I made at the outset. I do believe a future Irish government, just out of a sense of care and caution, will need to put in place proposals as to what an Irish state would be prepared to give up in order to achieve reunification. Because one of the extraordinary things about the Good Friday settlement is that we in the South have delegated to other people and another country responsibility for when to call a referendum in our own country. So it's a matter for the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to determine whether or not there should be a border poll, and it's also then a matter for the people of Northern Ireland to vote upon it. That's going to trigger us having to make votes. And there's difficult decisions to be made. But
do you regret that that decision was taken back in 1998, or is it just sort of past history?
No, I think it was a very sensible decision. But it is interesting that when there is or when there will be a referendum in the South on this question is not something that's exclusively within the control of the Southern establishment, Southern political establishment. So that's why I think it is important for a future Irish government to prepare.
Claire, what do you see as the key issues should we ever get to that campaign in terms of trying to persuade the floating voters?
Well, I think what people want is information, and sometimes people do have questions, which is understandable. Sometimes those undecided and open-minded voters, people are saying, well, look, they've got questions, so let's just never talk about it. Let's just not have the conversation. And I think people are hungry for information. We are finding engagement from across the community, and we are doing very structured engagement with people who didn't grow up maybe in a traditional nationalist household or neighbourhood in a very definite way. We want it to be a debate of interest and pragmatism, and not an identity or head count way. So the key issues, I mean, people will in many cases vote in their pragmatic economic interests. We've done a lot of work on that. We published a paper a couple of months ago that looked at the convergence opportunities, that looked at, I suppose, the tale of two economies, North and South, and the different decision-making ability and how it has turbocharged the Republic's economy and left ours behind, and the decisions that can be taken right now to ensure a more successful New Ireland. Yes, people will want, particularly people from a unionist background, will want to understand the protections for their identity and how they will be validated and vindicated. But Ireland has shown, the Republic has shown its ability to manage a change of people, going from a minority ethnic population, for example, of like 1 or 2% to 20%, and has done that really well, and shown itself able to accommodate difference and pluralism. So yes, people have questions, but they want them to be stared at in the face and worked through, rather than taking that lack of information as a charter for doing nothing. But as I say, the headline that unionists aren't engaging, I don't think is true. And you or somebody made a comment about the people not in the room. I think we've got a really wide range of contributors today, but people are interested. We've been doing town hall meetings in 10 or 12 towns across the north over the last few months, and substantial numbers of the people coming to those don't come from a traditional SDLP background. So the type of planning that we're talking about with a minister through the New Ireland Forum will colour in the blanks that and the questions that people currently have.
Stephen, obviously we don't know whether any of these votes will happen, and if so, which one would happen first and which would happen second. But there is a kind of an interlinking, isn't there? Not just geographically, but if an offer is made, for instance, in relation to the payment of pensions in Northern Ireland, you'll be looking at that in Scotland and saying a government in Westminster maybe have to match that for us and so on. And, you know, to what extent do you think that there'll be, if one of these situations is being negotiated, the negotiators, particularly in London, will have the other one in mind?
Of course they will. I mean, this is, look, we are so interconnected in these islands. I often think, you know, there are few closer relationships than we have. I'm a Stephen Patrick Gethins for a good reason, because of our interconnectedness with this particular island. But it talks to me, I mean, something that we've been looking at, for example. So Mark talked right at the start about the issue of voluntary. Now, why is that important? Because before an election, you know, we're Democrats. You're wanting to give people a choice, an informed choice. And the reason we have manifestos and we set out electoral systems is so that people know when they go and vote that what they're voting for, and therefore they can live with the consequences afterwards, even if they don't like the consequence. That's the way a healthy democracy works. And that point that Mark made earlier on in terms of a voluntary union. Now, I'm worried that we no longer have a voluntary union. I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but that changes the dynamic. And how do you keep a population with you? How do you stop a population from getting frustrated if you don't set it out? Now, Northern Ireland, a mechanism has been set out. Now, we can debate and discuss. It might be imperfect. Some people might like it, some people might not. But a mechanism has been set out. We don't have that in Scotland.
You're bringing a bill forward, aren't you, trying to move the decision-making process on a future vote from Westminster to
Yeah, that's
Edinburgh.
right. So we're bringing forward a private members bill. I've brought forward plenty of private members bills at Westminster, some with more success than others, usually less success than others, given the way that Westminster works. My most successful one was actually No to a No Deal Brexit, that I was, of course, author of. But that was because we worked with others. But I think we owe it to our populations to give them a bit of certainty. And here's the other thing. If we don't have a mechanism, then you end up talking about process when actually all of us, believe it or not, want to be talking about the substance. I want to have an independent Scotland because I believe that will make people's lives better, that will make our public services better. My colleagues in pro-union parties take a different view. That's fine. But people want you to be discussing the substantive issues. But without a mechanism, you so often end up falling back onto process again, and that has other dangers.
Mark, you were looking forward to maybe a future in which whatever happens in terms of independence or devolution, that you can have better working between the Celtic nations. We do have these bodies, and you've belonged to the various meetings of British Irish Council, things that were set up under the Good Friday Agreement. Are they in any way effective, or could they provide the embryo of a more effective mechanism in the future?
Well, in my experience, they are definitely useful. They are limited in the impact that they can have, but they're important in relationship building and a bit of agenda setting. We would need something significantly more than that in a changed set of circumstances for the future. We've talked about the Nordic model, but there are other models in Europe already. There is the Benelux model, there is the Baltic model. All of these involve to different degrees some sharing of decision making, some sharing of political authority. If the path of the next decade takes us away from the arrangements we are in now, then I think there is a real obligation on people involved in those discussions to be talking not just about what we are leaving, but what our destination is. And some of those models are absolutely worth being part of that conversation.
Claire, I was saying that Jim, in his paper, set out various things in terms of retention of PSNI, and I think he had Stormont as the possible home of an upper house. I mean, in your vision of what a united Ireland would look like politically, is there still a place for Stormont, and would it be the current Stormont, which, as you know, is not a terribly popular institution right now?
Yeah, well, look, all of those things, and this isn't running away from the question, all of those things will be by design and by negotiation. But we have set out in a recent framework document, we've looked at decision making, and we've identified Stormont as a block and a drag on effective decision making, and in our view, the most effective model for the successful, modern, pluralist, economically dynamic new nation that we're building is a unitary state. And as it happens, the way things are with Stormont at the moment, and you'll know the SDLP is campaigning intensively for Stormont reforms, and that's gathering some pace, it is not beloved of the community. And I think the concept of look, we've got this vision, we're all going along, it'll be X, Y, and Z. But by the way, those will have that same lot looking after your public services. I'm not sure will be a big seller when the time comes to make that decision, unless Stormont ups its game quite substantially. So all of that will be worked out. There's no sunset clause on Stormont in the Good Friday Agreement. There's nothing that says it goes away. So unless we collectively decide. But I think and we've all spoken about the sliver of influence that this part of the world has in Westminster. I mean, those numbers are very clear about the heft that the population in this region would have in a future Dáil, and the influence that political unionism could have if it retained, I suppose, cohesion as an electoral movement. But no, the SDLP has set out quite clearly in our Success by Design economic document that we think the most effective decision making will be a unitary unitary state. There's a great conversation to be had.
Rulers, basically.
Sorry?
Your direct rulers, but just from Dublin.
Well, we start that conversation, great conversation to be had about devolution on the island of Ireland. If you look at the lack of empowerment of councils and that principle, that Hume principle of subsidiarity and taking decisions as close to the ground as you can, we believe in, and there are opportunities to level that up. All of this and part of the pitch in the Republic is that this process can make new what needs to be new in Ireland, the things that need to change, including distribution of resources and, yes, distribution of power as well. So this can catalyse some of those conversations, because you talked about the 6 counties of the north being the most wounded and scarred by partition, which is absolutely true, but other counties in Ulster feel that as well. And as I say, this is about building something new and different and better, and where power is diffused around the island can be a part of that conversation.
Jim, a decade ago, I mean, there was a lot of talk that the Brexit vote will be a game changer. Isn't the truth that whilst it's added a potent extra argument, as it were, to the Irish nationalist case, that it hasn't actually changed the numbers maybe as much as people thought it might a decade ago?
Yeah, a bit like the French Revolution. I think it's too early to say the impact of Brexit, but I think it has had a significant impact, Mark. Like, one of the things I was very surprised at, I'm conscious that political unionism will be very hesitant about engaging in discussions such as this. But what I was surprised, after I wrote the paper you referred to, a lot of civic unionism, people from loyalist, unionist backgrounds, they want to talk about this. They maybe don't want to talk about it publicly, but they want to hear a discussion about it. And I remember doing a debate one evening, I don't know if it was with yourself, and there was a unionist politician on, and I was saying, isn't Unified Ireland the constitution, new mechanism for the whole island? And quite legitimately and understandably, he said, show it to me. So maybe there is a lot to be said for what I said at the outset, in terms of the Irish government, because of the fact that we need to prepare for something that could be outside our control in terms of the triggering of a referendum, just set out what the South is prepared to do. I know there may be a lot of opposition to that. People may say that's not engaging enough with Northern Ireland. But I suppose it is a discussion that needs to be had in the South as well. And I suppose the only reason to do this, the only reason for this discussion is if it improves the lives of people on the island of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and in the South. There's no point in having reunification unless it's going to improve the lives of ordinary people. And I'm convinced that it will.
Okay, I think we're slightly over our original time. But then we've missed various deadlines for border polls, so we can miss a deadline for the end of this session. I'll call that to an end, and if everyone could still keep their seats, because we're going to do a swift change. But can I ask for a big round of applause for Jim O'Callaghan, Claire Hanna, Mark Drakeford and Stephen Gethins?